Welcome to the launch of the 2022 Africa Agriculture Trade Monitor, AATM. I am Laye Butake, Director of Communication and Outreach for AKADEMIYA2063, and it is an absolute pleasure and honor to be hosting you in today's session as we unveil the 5th edition of the AATM. This report, which is published by AKADEMIYA2063 and the International Food Policy Research Institute, is a leading continental publication and a key source of evidence on trends in African agricultural trade and policies. Today, we will hear from an exciting lineup of high-level speakers who will debate the findings of the report. Please drop your comments and questions in the chat of whichever platform where you are watching us from. You can do that on IFPRI.org, on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or on Twitter with the hashtag AskIFPRI. Without further ado, let's kick this off by inviting our first speaker. He is the Deputy Division Director, Africa Regional Office at the International Food Policy Research Institute. Welcome, Dr. Samuel Benin.
Thank you, Laye. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are connecting from. Honorable speakers, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. On behalf of my Director General, Jo Swenen, I would like to welcome you to this joint AKADEMIYA2063 and IFPRI launch of the 5th edition of the Africa Agriculture Trade Monitor, or AATM for short. The role of agricultural trade in ensuring Africa's food security and nutrition has never been questioned. Because of the series of events, including the locust infestation in Eastern Africa, the COVID-19 global pandemic, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine that is now entering its 8th month, on top of the already high agricultural and food prices due to climate change and other factors, the role of trade in increasing resilience in this volatile environment cannot be overemphasized. The 2022 AATM helps us to deepen our understanding of the relationship between African agricultural trade and food and nutrition security in several important ways, including, for example, analysis of the regional and continental trade in different value chains and their nutritional content, the transformative impact of African continental free trade area on the region's economies, and the evolution of trade flows and policies in one of the regional economic communities. The results of the analysis confirm that there is a high opportunity cost associated with weak implementation of the African continental free trade area agreement, for example, and that it is crucial to take a more ambitious approach that fully liberalizes tariffs and reduces non-tariff measures. The researchers who have done a very fine job are here to present you the details, including their recommendations. Our invaluable partners too are here to give you their perspectives, practices, experiences, and lessons on the issues. It is why I am very pleased to welcome you again to be part of this joint AKADEMIYA2063 and IFPRI launch of the 2022 AATM, and wish you a fruitful deliberation. Thank you, and over to you, Laye.
Thank you very much, Dr. Benin, for those remarks. Moving on to our next speaker, we are honored to have the president of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, AGRA. Please welcome Dr. Agnes Kalibata for her opening remarks. Dr. Kalibata.
Thank you so much, moderator, and thank you for welcoming us to this conversation and meeting. I really want to appreciate the work done here by Academia, and I want to appreciate the work done here by IFPRI and the partnership that the two institutions bring on the table. For all of us, for the work we are trying to do in the agricultural sector, and for the work that you all have done under this trade work. The work you've done in trade and agricultural transformation is extremely important, because I do believe that we are where we are as a continent talking about food crisis in Africa, not because we can't produce food, but because we still have challenges figuring out the trade question of food. We have perfected how to buy food. We still have to perfect how to engage farmers in producing and being part of supplying us food. So that part, the markets and trade part, remains probably, from where I'm sitting, remains probably the number one challenge this continent has to address, but also the number one opportunity. And that's why, piggybacking on the African Free Continental Trade Area that has just been launched and is now looking to be active and to deliver, is probably has to be our number one priority. Ensuring that trade environment works has to be our number one priority. So helping us understand what it is from country to country that is making it impossible for us to put our understanding of this big opportunity, our ability to translate it into jobs for Africa's youth, our ability to have the agriculture sector translate into reduced poverty for our continent, helping us understand why we have failed to grip that and bring it and take it and use it to bring it to bear for our continent is something that is extremely important. And I look forward to the conversation that we are going to have here today. As AGRA, as you would know, we really have worked a lot on trying to understand the type of systems that would help deliver farmers from poverty. So we've worked on seed systems, we've been working on policy and state capability, we've been working on understanding how fertilizer systems can work better. But at the end of the day, when we engage the countries we are working in, 9 out of 11 countries, you ask them, what is it that you want us to do differently as we go into a new strategy? And you know that during the last AGRF, we launched our new strategy. When you ask them, what is the number one thing you would like AGRA to work on? Everybody tells you, if you can work on the question of markets and trade, you would have done a lot. So we are trying to understand and to figure out, what does markets and trade mean in these countries? What? We've specialized and focused on staple crops intentionally because some people call them orphaned crops. Orphaned in terms of science, orphaned in terms of research, orphaned in terms of business environment, but also orphaned in terms of markets and trade. So I look forward to listening to you all and helping us and really trying to get a sense of how we can make the system around markets and trade work for farmers. So I'm excited to be part of this conversation, and I congratulate you all for getting to this point. And again, I look forward to this meeting. So thank you again for having me, and let's go into the conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kalibata, for those remarks. And now it's my absolute honor, ladies and gentlemen, to welcome for his opening remarks, Honorable Dr. Jean Chrysostome Ngabitsinze. He is the Minister of Trade and Industry for Rwanda. Honorable Minister.
Thank you. Good day, distinguished guests, all protocol observed. It's my pleasure to be participating in this event where we will be launching the 5th edition of the Africa Agriculture Trade Monitor, and I am delighted to welcome you all. The task of today's session will be to debate the findings and the policy implication of the 2022 AATM, a leading a continental report which addresses issues of critical importance to Africa's agriculture trade, resilience, and economic development. These topics could not be more urgent, especially against the backdrop of recent shocks. World agriculture production, chains, and trade have been facing a series of events that threatened global food security and jeopardized African efforts to create resilient food systems. This situation calls for policies that would leverage the potential of regional trade for stabilizing domestic food supply across the continent, hence reducing the dependence on international supply sources and exposure to external shocks. Climate change significantly affects global cereals and vegetable oil production every year, reducing market supplies while demand remains strong due to global population growth and urbanization. Faced with rising food prices, many governments have adopted export bans or export taxes on cereals. In the cases of Russia, Moldova, Serbia, Hungary, Kazakhstan, palm oil in the case of Indonesia, or fertilizers in the case of China. Meanwhile, the global economy is still recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exacerbated this problem, pushing up the price of oil and affecting production and export of wheat, sunflower seeds, and oil, corn, and barley from Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. The combination of the shocks affects agriculture trade and food security throughout Africa, especially in countries that are highly dependent on food imports. The role of trade in creating resilience in this volatile environment is crucial, and this fifth AATM sheds light on current patterns and trends in intra-African trade and examines the potentially transformative impact of the African continental free trade area on the continent's economies. In spite of this volatility, one thing is clear. The extending of trade links between African countries, thanks to the establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area, may make it possible to decrease the risk of food insecurity in the long term, broad diversification of supply sources, and increased ease of access for all farmers to a large market. Furthermore, there is a need for countries to implement trade facilitation, disputes, and free movement agreements. We must work to harmonize regional economic community frameworks and establish a coherent strategy for infrastructure development. Let us leverage the African Continental Free Trade Area, which provides a framework for the development and strengthening of integration and cooperation efforts of African countries by promoting integration of production and infrastructure, along with manifest cooperation between the various African regions bodies. I would like to congratulate AKADEMIYA2063 and the International Food Policy Research Institute for yet another edition of this rich report, which should serve as an evidence-based guide for policymakers across the continent. I am confident that the quality of our deliberations today will make good fodder for policy actors and enrich our understanding of Africa's agriculture trade performance, challenges, and opportunities. I wish us all a fruitful dialogue and exchange at these sessions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Honorable Minister Ngabitsinze. We are so honored by your presence. Thank you for honoring our invitation. Thank you to all our opening remarks speakers, Dr. Kalibata, Dr. Benen. Thank you so much. And now let us move on to the thrust of this session. What are the key findings of the 2022 Africa Agriculture Trade Monitor? What are the policy implications of this report? To shed light and to answer these questions, it is my pleasure to welcome the Executive Chairperson of AKADEMIYA2063, Dr. Usman Badian.
Thank you very much, Lai. And good day, good morning, afternoon to everybody, Your Excellency and others around the table here. Agnes, my sister from Agra, thank you very much for joining us. I'll be presenting the highlights of the 2020 Africa Trade Monitor. I'm the presenter, the editors leading this work, and who this year again have really produced an excellent report, Antoine Bouet from AfPRI, Sunday Ojo from AKADEMIYA2063, and Shahid Zaki from the Cairo University and AgroDep. We can go to the next slide. The AATM Africa Agriculture Trade Monitor is published jointly by the International Food Policy Research Institute, AfPRI. It is supported financially by USAID and Germany's BMZ, a team of co-editors by AKADEMIYA2063, I just presented those of this report. It was produced by AKADEMIYA2063 communications team, and it is one of the flagships of AKADEMIYA2063 results and agri-depth programs. Next slide. So the content of the 2022 AATM, it looks at the current global food market crisis and its relationship with African countries. It looks at Africa's participation in global agricultural value chains, the role plays therein. Then it turns to intra-African trade in agriculture. It looks at trade in the featured value chains of cocoa, coffee, and tea. Every edition looks at specific value chains, and it also looks a little bit in depth into the African continental free trade area, into the ambitions and implementation. Next slide. In all of these areas, we have our conventional wisdom. What the report does is to go beyond the surface and give us a little bit more of the evidence. I'll be brief in my presentation and just highlight a few excerpts from a few chapters. When it comes to the Ukraine crisis, I think Minister from Rwanda referred to it. The rising global prices were already starting before due to climatic events, export bans and taxes and other policies, also put to biofuels, which all are pushing prices up. So the crisis just made a difficult situation worse. In terms of Africa's contribution to global value chains, it is small, but it's growing at a significant pace. You'll see it when I show the graphs on that. In terms of intra-African trade, Africa exports, still global participation. Africa does export intermediate goods that are used in third-party countries to produce finished products. For example, to the EU, where Africa's share of intermediate product in EU's final product can be up to 40% of its gross exports. So it is still Africa importing relatively little intermediate goods to process into high-value products. And that's really where the money is. We are on track to doing that, but there's a lot of room to go there, and you'll see it. So we import intermediate goods for a little bit of value addition, we export a lot of intermediate goods to others at a lot of value and keep the goodies. And the factors behind that, of course, weak manufacturing base and the abundance of natural resources such as land and mines that position Africa to provide these raw materials. Next slide, please. And here in terms of intra-African trade, the COVID crisis really illustrated what we need to do as we go into the African continental free trade area. Africa's intra-trade declined significantly across economic regions except the East African community. Why? Because of the trade facilitations and all the efforts that are being made in this community to increase trade. So it did survive these large shocks. So that is something that we need to keep our minds on. Over the last 2 decades, intra-African exports have grown rapidly, in particular for processed products. The share of intra-African trade, however, is much higher in the food sectors in terms of calorie, fats, and proteins than in terms of value. Although going forward, again, for the AfCFTA, Africa still faces high escalating tariff and non-tariff measures internally, not externally, internally, and that will need to be taken care of as we move forward. Next slide, please. In terms of the AfCFTA itself, most tariffs are supposed to be eliminated, but there are clauses on sensitive and excluded products which may create loopholes and delay implementation. If you just remember the thing I talked about in terms of high tariffs and non-tariff barriers, so these loopholes might delay the benefits from the AfCFTA. Africa still faces significant non-tariff measures that will have to be addressed, and it is clear from the work in this chapter that it's just not the tariffs, but the non-tariff measures that needs to be dealt with, because the impact and contribution far outweighs the impact and contribution from tariff eliminations. Next slide. I'll be now showing you a few graphs and tables from the report. This one is showing what was really driving global prices already before the war. Export restrictions, and particularly in China, or high gas prices in the EU, which pushed fertilizer prices and on top of that, the Russian invasion. There were drivers already behind higher food prices. If the war were to stop, the world is most likely going to see higher prices, and therefore we need to equip ourselves accordingly. Next slide. And here we're looking at African countries that are the most exposed, and you know them in particular. This is North African countries exposed most of cereals, but also countries like Nigeria, Kenya, and Cote d'Ivoire as well. Next slide. Here we're looking at Africa's participation in the global value chains. The yellow part of the bars are how much of foreign intermediate goods Africa imports to add value and exports. The orange shows you how much of intermediate goods Africa exports to others to add value. So those orange bars is where we need to grow into to create value and create wealth. It is still high, 85% of what we produce in terms of intermediate goods. And that's where I think we have an opportunity to boost manufacturing and add value. Next slide. You will see here that across the different sectors, it is in textile, the blue part, where Africa imports intermediate goods, machinery, chemicals, and others to add value. And the least performing is agriculture, where you primarily export the orange part fraction of our value addition to others to add value. So we need to reclaim that. Next slide. And here is intra-African trade. You look to the right, to the left is the intra-African trade in terms of value, which stagnated and peaked in 2013. And next to it, you look at intra-African trade by nutrient, calorie, protein, and fat. So we're exporting more and expanding trade in food products, and we're exporting more in higher value non-food products. So that's the dynamics that's happening currently in Africa's current trade. Next slide. And here, Africa is exporting more and more of processing, semi and processed goods. The share is now about 73% Africa average, driven primarily by ECOWAS and to a lesser extent by COMESA. So the processing sector is driving a trade within Africa and externally. Next slide. And here, we all complain about tariff escalation, high tariffs. African intra-trade is not just facing high tariffs, but also tariff escalation. You look at the example of cocoa from 3.2 if it's unprocessed to double that when it's processed, and again, almost double that again when it's fully processed. So that kind of tariff escalation will have to go away. Otherwise, Africa is going to be in the same situation of producing raw materials for the rest of the world. Intra-trade need to take that away. Thank you. Next slide. And you also see that African countries are subjecting each other to the same non-tariff measures similar to what you're observing outside of Africa. Ghana and Mali's ATM on non-tariff measures, ECCAS is here, on cocoa are similar to what Colombia, China, Hong Kong, and South Asia region are applying here. So that too is what Africa needs to deal with in order to further facilitate intra-African trade. So it's not just others doing it to us, we're doing it within the continent. And this way AfCFTA has to really pay a lot of attention. Next slide. And you look at here, what is really holding African trade down is not just those high tariff or the non-tariff measures that are like SPS, but look at the processing time of processing imports and exports in terms of time and cost equivalence. Up to 100 hours to 60 hours to process imports and exports in Africa compared to the orange and yellow bars that you have, which are other regions, or the equivalent cost up to $700 or $200 at minimum, just border compliance and documentary compliance across African ports and airports. Again, another big job for the AfCFTA to address. So I think this will be the next slide. Go to the next one. These were the just highlights of some of these chapters. This is an excellent report. There's a lot of in-depth looking under the surface of what is there. And I do wish you all an excellent reading. And again, congratulations to Antoine, Ojo, and Zahir for a great report. And thank you to all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Dr. Badian. Your presentation has set the stage for what I am confident will be an exciting and insightful conversation with the three editors of the 2022 Africa Agriculture Trade Monitor. But before we get into the panel, let's take a look at some highlights from the 2022 AATM video on your screen.
Did you know the Africa Agriculture Trade Monitor is a leading continental publication and a key source of evidence on trends in African agricultural trade and policies? Published by AKADEMIYA2063 and the International Food Policy Research Institute, the annual flagship report uses high-quality data analysis to review Africa's progress in trade development with new analysis on critical topics for trade in Africa's agri-food sector. Designed to strengthen evidence-based policymaking in agricultural trade in support of the comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program, the 4 editions of the AATM since 2018 have covered the impact of COVID-19 on African agricultural trade, the role of informal cross-border flows in Africa's trade, regional trade integration and intra-African trade, and the status and trends and competitiveness of African countries in global and intra-African agricultural markets. We are excited to launch the 5th edition of the Africa Agriculture Trade Monitor. The 2022 AATM sharpens our understanding of African agricultural trade by analyzing regional and continental trade in agriculture and select value chains with analysis of nutritional content of African trade, the potentially transformative impact of the African continental free trade area on the region's economies, and the evolution, intra and extra-regional trade flows and trade policy of the Economic Community of Central Africa states. The report models the impacts on trade, growth, and welfare of several potential approaches to the AfCFTA implementation and analyzes trends and policy issues in value chains for stimulants, cocoa, coffee, and tea. And there's more. With special thanks to the editors, contributors, and the production team, we invite you to explore this latest edition of the Africa Agriculture Trade Monitor to access improved trade statistics and indicators for deeper insights into Africa's agricultural trade. Click on the DOI and start reading today. We can't wait to show you the rest.
And now let me welcome the moderator of the panel session, Dr. Heike Hoffler, Project Lead, Agricultural Trade, Agribusiness with GIZ. Over to you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you so much, Dr. Butake, and I would like to welcome again everyone attending this seminar and the launch of the 22 AATM. Now that we've heard the highlights and the main messages, we would want to dive a bit deeper into some of the contents that have already been presented by Dr. Badian, and we will do that by inviting the 3 mentioned editors of this year's report, and I will introduce them in a segment, and this will be followed by some interventions from 3 invited discussants, and that again will then be followed by an open Q&A inviting all of you. So this is just as a reminder that we would like to hear from you. Please participate in our Q&A session, and please submit your questions on ifpri.org, on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or using the hashtag AskIFPRI on Twitter. So this, please let us hear from you. And with those few remarks, I will now move to the editors panel. And I would like to invite for the first intervention, Dr. Sunday Pierre Ojo. He's the Deputy Director, Knowledge Systems with Academia. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So, yes, I'm expecting your question. I think you have some questions.
So okay, fine. I think particularly from your side, we wanted to hear a comment on the rapid rise of processed goods and foods. How does that reflect in the intra-African trade, the increase in trade in processed foods?
Thank you. Yes, this may not be visible, physically visible, but the data reflects a process, an ongoing process of manufacturing of food products. The data show that despite what we think, there are some technologies that are used to process agricultural products. For example, we noted in Chapter 3 that about 2 decades ago, 63% of intra-African export of agricultural products were either fully processed or semi-processed products. Currently, over the last 3 years, the share increased from 63% to 72%. So only 28% of agricultural products traded within Africa are still unprocessed now. And the chapter also shows some regional differences in terms of processing of agricultural products. To illustrate, we noted that 42% of ECOWAS intra-African export received some level of processing in 2003-2005, but that share amounted now to 77%. The pace is a bit slower in other regions, and the reason is that those regions had attained a higher level of processing already. I think it's become a bit difficult to continue growing when you are already at a high level. For example, you see AMO, the Arab Maghreb Union was processing up to 89% of intra-African exports, and currently it's fallen to 68%, which is still a good process. And so, yes, processing is in progress, and this is triggered by higher incomes, population growth, and rapid urbanization. So, yes, those processing firms may not be seen, but the data reflects that there is a good process there. Back to you.
Thank you so much. May I just stay here for a second, because I think this is very interesting. Do you have a particular explanation why the ECOWAS region was produces such a strong growth in the trade of processed food compared to other regions?
Yeah. I think what is to be explained is probably why the share of ECOWAS a couple of decades ago was so little at 42%, while the other regions are at least at 70%. So I think that the reason may be related to, as I said, the trends we are seeing in terms of income growth and urbanization. It is a region where urbanization and change in lifestyles, change in consumption habits are growing very fast. So there a demand has been noticed, and even though African exporters may be not so competitive outside Africa, they can seize the opportunity to fill in the new demand that are coming up within the continent. And food processing is a very promising market, and West Africa is feeding into that. Back to you.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for these clarification. I think that gives a bit more feel to it. I would like to ask you one last question before moving on. Coming back to the nature of processed foods, we know that these are relatively high in calories, fat, sugar, other nutrients that are associated with rather the risks of non-communicable diseases and rather nutritional risks. Is this being reflected in the trade flows you've analyzed? And if so, what steps can or should policymakers take to mitigate these nutritional risks and dietary issues associated with the increase in consumption of processed food?
Thank you. Yes, in fact, this report has made a good analysis in terms of trade in nutrients. We used to conduct the analysis in terms of gross value, but here we consider the trade in nutritional contents terms, and the results are very informative in terms of how trade could contribute to food security in Africa. You know, in value terms, intra-Africa trade represents something like 19 to 21% of African trade. But when you express African trade in terms of nutrient content, the share is larger. For example, you can see that up to 39% of all traded calories are traded within the continent, and 28% of all traded fats, and 37% of traded proteins. As regard the fats, this is where there is a bit concern. So if you consider these shares at the regional level, the content in fats of a region's trade within Africa maybe has 76% for at Africa level, but at the regional level it is up to 85% in ECCAS. It is even up to 98% in the Arab Maghreb Union. So this level of fat content is a concern, and it is important to consider more research to see how this concern maybe is true or not. But in case this becomes a true concern, there are some steps that should be taken to mitigate the risk associated, the health risks that could be associated. Those steps could include developing some norms and standards about nutrient content during processing. Back to you.
Thank you so much for particularly illustrating where these details lie, and I also learned a lot here, particularly concerning the issue about the fat and sugar contents. So I think a lot of accompanying research would be nice, but also maybe alongside them research and also some advice in the direction, the steps you've mentioned, because we know how important these nutritional risks are, and as we all know, we've moved from a double burden to a triple burden in a number of countries already. So thanks very much, Dr. Ojo, for your remarks and deeper dive on some of the matters. I would like to move on to our second editor to Dr. Antoine Bouet, a Senior Research Fellow at IFPRI, and I would like to invite him to talk a bit about the AfCFTA, which also marks one of the AfCFTA implementation, which marks one of the chapters of this year's report. And I would like to hear from you a bit more about what do you think are the adequate steps to monitor progress and the impact of AfCFTA implementation in order to also see, is it on track, what needs to be corrected while we go along, even though the process might take some time. But how can we monitor the progress, and what do you see in terms of intra-African trade, agriculture trade, the priorities for either African institutions, for country governments, for technical and development partners, and who should be doing what and looking for what?
Yeah, thank you very much, Heike, for this question. So the AfCFTA, which is the abbreviations for the African Continental Free Trade Area. So it will be considered as successful, of course, if it has a significant impact on intra-African trade. And so here we need a precise and right measurement of intra-African trade. And of course, as everybody knows right now, I think trade is not well measured, cross-border trade is not well measured in Africa. So, for example, if you look at a recent study from the Economic Commission from Africa, it concludes that informal trade is estimated to